Hello, this is the first of what will probably be videos um, to kind of augment or supplement Bible survey here for however long the coronavirus situation lasts. So this first video that we're going to have this evening and for the course is looking at some kind of introductory material and ideas, concepts around what in the New Testament are called the Gospels. Now, Gospels is a variation of an Old English word, God's spell, or which is in turn an Old English term for a Greek term, evangelion, or the good news, or the pronouncement. So the question, one of the questions for us is, what exactly is the good news? Is the good news a specific set of teachings about Jesus? He died on the cross for our sins so we could go to heaven. Is Jesus himself the good news? Is the announcement that Jesus is here? But regardless of how you look at it in biblical terms, in the text, in terms of the text of the Bible, the four Gospels are the first four books of what Christians call the New Testament. So they're coming after the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and they begin with telling the story of Jesus' life. And Jesus will be the central figure in all of the New Testament, and then the central figure, obviously, in Christianity. And the Gospels tell the story of Jesus' life. So a question that people often have is, why are there four of them? Why not just one? Or why not dozens? If there's four, couldn't there be more than that? And in actuality, there are, quite a number of ancient documents that sometimes are called Gospels. There's infancy Gospels of Jesus, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary, which most of which are kind of early Christian or pseudo-Christian writings, often from like the 2nd to the 4th century, and for various reasons did not kind of make the cut into the official list or canon of the New Testament. And for reasons that are kind of more complex than we can go into, some didn't make it because they don't really seem to be full gospels. They're really more perhaps collections of statements that Jesus may or may not have made. Some seem consistent to who Jesus is in the four Gospels we have. Some of his statements in these other Gospels seem quite contrary. And to that end, some of them didn't kind of make it into the New Testament because they were deemed to be heretical. And heresy is kind of wrong teaching in the church's eyes. So these, they might contain things that are kind of related to kind of a early religious system that was a deviation of Christianity called Gnosticism, which we're not really going to go into much in this course, but if you took a church history course, you would learn quite a bit about Gnosticism. So some of these Gospels aren't in the Bible because they're not complete Gospels. They maybe have teachings that the early church felt was deviated too far from Orthodox or traditional or right Christian teaching, Gnosticism being one example. Also, they were suspect the further their origin is out from the time of Jesus' life. That raised questions about whether or not they should be included in the Bible. So one of the questions that we have about all of these books is when exactly were they written? How close to Jesus' life were the Gospels that we do have, the four that are in the New Testament? How close are they to Jesus? And scholars differ on that quite a bit, actually. From the most conservative scholars would say that the earliest Gospel is probably written around 50 AD, so within about 15 to 25 years after Jesus' life. Perhaps we have the Gospel of Mark. And then the latest gospel, which is probably Gospel John, might be written around 80 or 90 AD. So all four gospels in that conservative traditional view are written within a lifetime or so. Even the latest would be about 50 years after Jesus. So you could still conceivably have eyewitnesses, people that had actually interacted with Jesus and knew him, that could be speaking into the writing of these books. Other scholars put the dates later, either at the end of the first century for the earliest, and then into the second century, or later than that. I tend to personally find more credence to maybe not the very earliest datings, but generally in the first century, and kind of starting within 30 years or so of Jesus, and going to the end of the first century for the 4 Gospels that we have. So one of the things, so I've included on the Foxtail site a link to a site that compares the New Testament to other historical documents. So I want to comment on that for a moment and just explain why that link is there. I ask you to maybe look at that as you're listening to this or soon after. So it's a list that compares ancient documents like Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey or the works of Plato or Aristotle. And it makes 2 statements about them. One is, how many copies of those ancient documents do we have? And we tend to have very few. Even for some of the most famous works in Western civilization, the works of Plato, the works of Aristotle, the works of Homer, we have very, very few copies of those writings. And the earliest copies we have, and this is the other thing that this chart points out, the earliest copies we have tend to be hundreds of years later. So in the case of Jesus, if Jesus lived in the first century, and the Gospels compared to these documents, we wouldn't begin seeing Christian documents until like the 900s, like around the end of the first millennium and into the second millennium. So around like 900 to 1100, for example. And there's very few copies. But we tend to trust more or less that the version of the Iliad that we read is probably somewhat close to whoever Homer was, wrote, what this person Homer wrote, or that at least the writings of Aristotle and Plato bear some close resemblance to the actual people, Plato and Aristotle, and their thinking, even though we have very few documents to verify that, and there's a huge gap between when those people lived and our oldest copies. Okay, so that's the first part of the chart is kind of illustrating that for most ancient texts, we do not have very many copies. Then it gets down to the New Testament, and things change significantly. And rather than having, less than 10 copies of most of these ancient documents, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of them, and we have them within 100 years. We have copies of various New Testament books that go back to within 100 years of the first century. So by the end of the second century, we're starting to find copies of Paul's letters, copies of parts of the gospel, for example, that date that far back. So I want to be clear. This chart is not saying that this proves that the New Testament is true. It's not trying to make that statement at all, and I'm certainly not asking you to look at it in that regard. What it does argue is this, and I think this is still important, is it's arguing that even though we don't know that the miracles that are described in the Gospels happened, or that Jesus literally, that having all these copies, you could have tons of copies of forgeries. Right? You could have tons of very old copies of made-up stories. You could have tons of old copies of, a complete fairy tale. But what it does argue is that the New Testament we have is almost identical to the New Testament that the early Christians had. That because we have so many copies and because they are so old, we have fragments of copies of the New Testament that go back to within 100 years or less in some cases of the originals. We have very little of the New Testament we have has been changed over time. Now, there have been some changes over time, and we'll talk about that in coming weeks, but not very many. I mean, the accuracy and one of the things when you have a lot of copies that you can do is compare them. So the more copies you have, you can make comparisons and see how little they change or how much they change. And that can really help with the reliability of a document. So that's helpful in the New Testament's regard. And the other thing is, in terms of history, generally speaking, the closer you can get to an origin date, right? If you're, even recent history, like the closer you can get to documents about George Washington, the more confident you are that they're probably reliable, right? That there hasn't been time for changes and tradition and kind of layers of interpretation to enter into the story as much. If you get 1,000 years out, well, then who knows how much has crept in. So the fact that these documents are very old, close to the time of Jesus, and that there's many of them, kind of give us some confidence about the text. Again, I am not claiming that they prove that Jesus was born of a virgin or that they prove Jesus rose from the dead. But it does kind of give us quite a bit of confidence that early Christians thought that he did. That early Christians were writing this, and that we have many, many copies to verify this, and that they were writing this quite early. That Jesus' resurrection, or Jesus being some kind of divine human being, was not just something that got added 500, 600 years later. The earliest documents of the church kind of affirm that, and copies of the New Testament verify that. Okay, so that's what that is about. So back to the Gospels. So we have 4 of them. And one of the things that scholars, or really even casual readers, if you were to read all 4 Gospels one after another, one thing that people very quickly begin to notice is that 3 of them are very similar to each other. Matthew, Mark, and Luke often will read various stories in Jesus' life word for word, identical to one another. Like if you read the feeding of the 5,000, for example, or some other story from Jesus' life, there's a very good chance that either exactly the story will be told word for word in all 3 Gospels, or with only very, very small changes. And then you come to the Gospel of John, and it's definitely the same Jesus. John is not so different that you're wondering, is this even telling the same story? It's definitely talking about the same Jesus, living in the same time, being crucified on a cross and raising from the dead on the 3rd day, and that kind of thing. But in a lot of ways, John is very, very different. So scholars for a very long time have wondered, why are Matthew and Mark and Luke so similar when John is so different? So an idea that has come up with that is called, they are called the Synoptic Gospels. Okay, so I've written this term out, synoptic, S-Y-N-O-P-T-I-C, synoptic, which means same eye. S-Y-N, same in Greek and Latin, and optic, your optic nerve, you go to an optometrist, same eye, same vision, same perspective. So the idea here is that somehow all 3 Gospels are looking at the life of Jesus from one perspective. So then the next question is, well, whose perspective is that, right? I think an easy way to picture this is Turnitin, everyone's favorite feature on Foxtail, right? So if you have a very high Turnitin score on work that you have submitted, and I see that as a professor, I very quickly come to the conclusion that, okay, you and someone else on campus have copied one another. Somebody has copied the other person's work. And then because so much of it is similar, like if you get a 95 Turnitin score, 95%, and then I click on the button and it says it's from one source at George Fox, who also reads identical except for very small changes, you would get called into my office and we would have to determine who is copying off of who, right? That somebody was the original source, and you or the other person had copied from them. So it seems very clear to scholars for thousands of years, from the early church on, that one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, was the first one, and that the other 2 borrowed from it or copied it or used it kind of as the foundation or base for their gospel, right? So is that cheating? Is that plagiarizing? Well, in an academic course, it would be. Like if you copied 80% of your work from someone else, you would fail that paper, fail that class. In the Gospels, that's not viewed really as a problem. I mean, it's just kind of shared sourcing, and we're going to talk a little bit in just a moment about how the Gospels seem to have come together. Okay, so the idea here is, where did this source come from, right? And why, which one was first, and why would the others have borrowed from it? Why not just leave it at one, right? Why not figure out, okay, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, that's the first and original gospel, and let's just let it be the only. Why would others add on to it? So we have a clue. We're going to return to this question of which one in just a moment. But we have a clue from the Gospel of Luke as to kind of maybe what some of the thinking going on these early gospel writers may have looked like. So if you have a Bible, this was in your assigned reading for the Gospel of Luke. But these are just the early verses of Luke 1. So I'm just going to read these and then make some comments about them. This is how the Gospel of Luke begins. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Okay, so note that first sentence, right? Many have written down, basically, is what he's saying. Many have written down accounts about Jesus' life. So Luke is saying, I'm not the only one here. Right? Like lots of people, many, however many we don't know how many he's talking about, but certainly more than one. Multiple people have written down accounts about what has happened among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants to the Lord, to the word. So that's also a significant statement, right? Just as they were handed down, these stories of Jesus were handed down to us by eyewitnesses, which kind of suggests a couple things, it seems to me, right? If we were in class together, I would ask you what this suggests, and I think very quickly most of you would come to see this. If Luke is saying the stories I'm writing down were handed to me, told to me by eyewitnesses, what does it suggest about Luke himself? That he is probably not an eyewitness. That Luke probably was not there. That he's relying on other people's accounts, other people's stories, right? And he says that it's not one, it's multiple eyewitnesses. So he's got multiple written accounts. There's other written stories of Jesus' life floating around out there. And there's multiple eyewitnesses who have contributed to these stories, right? So maybe it's Mary, Jesus' mother. Maybe it's Mary Magdalene. Maybe it's some of the 12 disciples. Maybe it's Peter, James, John, others who are telling stories. They're figures in the early church, and maybe they're getting older. If these Gospels are written kind of at the end of the first century, maybe these people that had known Jesus personally are starting to age, and they may be dying soon. And so they're passing on the stories of Jesus' life to Luke and to others who are collecting these stories. And then it goes on to say this: with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Right? So a comment or two about that sentence. With this in mind, I myself have carefully investigated everything. Right, so if you recall back to the very beginning of the semester, I made the suggestion that though some of us kind of have grown up maybe with this kind of mindset about the writing of the Bible, that somehow like God just kind of pried open the heads of these writers and poured the words in. Or maybe, they're sitting at a table somewhere with a stylus or a pen of some sort, and all of a sudden the Holy Spirit just kind of takes over and they just start writing. And they're not really thinking about what they're writing. God is just telling them what words to write down. And I think many of us, if we, maybe if we in early kind of experiences with the Bible, perhaps think that's kind of what happened. But what it seems to me Luke is pretty clearly saying is here, really, what I did is I sat down and wrote a research paper. I mean, I picture maybe papers you've written this year here in school, right? Where you've got some quotes that you've written down on index cards, you've got some books and articles sitting around your desk, and you're sitting in your dorm room or at home, and you sit down to write your paper, and you've got a variety of different sources that you're going to draw from, and you're going to pull all these pieces together. And then how does he conclude it? I investigated all this stuff, right? I read other sources, I talked to eyewitnesses. So that's kind of this data that he has for his research paper. And then I decided to write an orderly account, right? So to me, what that's suggesting, what to many scholars this suggests, is that he then sits down to, okay, now I'm going to make sense of all this various stuff. I'm going to put it in an order for you, right? He does not say, I wrote everything down in exactly the order that the events happened, or that I wrote down every single thing Jesus did, or every single thing Jesus said, right? He is what is sometimes called editing, right? He is biblical scholars will sometimes call this redacting, right? So this is another term that I've written down for you, that the gospel writers are redactors or editors, right? They're not just news reporters going out with their cell phone filming an event and then writing down the exact events. They're making choices, right? Out of all the things that Jesus did and said, they're picking some of them, right? In the Gospel of John, at the end of the Gospel of John, twice the writer of John says, Jesus did so many things. I could have filled every book in the world with the stuff Jesus did and said, right? I could have, there were dozens, hundreds of other things that were fascinating and amazing that Jesus said and did. But I chose these things because I thought they would help you. And what I want to focus on is this: I chose some of the things to put in it, right? That's editing, right? It's not like when you're a little kid and you're a 5-year-old and you're trying to describe a movie to your parents and you put in every single detail, so much detail that by the end of the story they can't even follow what you're talking about, right? As you get older and better at storytelling, you figure out, okay, these are the important parts. So when I'm describing this movie or this show that I love to my friends or my family, I don't tell every single detail. I pick and choose. Like I really highlight some elements, and other things aren't that important. I leave them out. That's editing. That's redacting. Sometimes on the news, you'll see like documents that get released out of the White House or from the FBI or something, and they'll say it is highly redacted. This was a highly redacted document, which means it's a document, but significant parts have been edited out or covered up, right? So redactors or editors are picking and choosing what they're including. So Luke is telling us that that's what he did, right? I read other stories about Jesus. I interviewed a ton of eyewitnesses. I investigated all of it. I collected a ton of stuff. And then I wrote some of it down into an orderly story, an orderly account of Jesus's life. I was an editor, right? So we've introduced a couple concepts here that that the gospel writers aren't just taking dictation, or at least Luke certainly isn't. He tells us he's not, right? God is not just telling him the words to write. Luke is thinking about it. He's considering other possibilities. He's considering a lot of information, and then he's putting some stuff down, right? So that's this first idea. The second idea is that's an editorial process or a redacting process. And so if you were to go on and take more classes or go further in biblical studies, you would hear this idea called redaction criticism or redaction studies. And that's really trying to just figure out, why do the gospel writers pick and choose the things they include? Why do some things get edited out? Why do some things get edited in? And that's this study of redaction criticism, the editorial decisions they make. Okay, so what I'm going to propose is that Luke is not the only gospel writer that does that. That I think all four of the gospel writers are making those kind of choices. That's similar to what John said, that John, I think in a different way makes the same point. Like, I had a ton of information. I had lots of things that I could have included, but I picked the important ones, the ones that were important to me. And what we'll see is, for John, some of those are the same as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but others are quite a bit different, right? John is very different. He makes different editorial choices than Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. Okay, so now, having looked at this little Luke thing, I want to return to this question that we started with, was why are they so similar? And if Matthew, Mark, and Luke have one perspective, this synoptic perspective, this same eye, whose eye is it? Okay, for quite a bit of church history, tradition was that it was Matthew. So for a very long time, and mostly because some of the early teachers of the church thought it was Matthew. Matthew was a very popular gospel in preaching in the early church. Some of the earliest sermons that we have that mention books of the Bible or quote the Bible in the New Testament in any way often quote Matthew. So because Matthew appears in early Christian sermons, there was thought that perhaps Matthew was the first. For the last couple hundred years, that idea has really fallen to the wayside. And the idea that has replaced it is the idea that Mark is the first gospel. So there's a term in biblical studies for that I want you to know. And that's this term of Markan priority, which basically means, as I say here on this sheet of paper, Mark came first. So Mark for Markan, which includes Mark, priority, Mark comes prior, Mark comes first. So if you were to read a book of New Testament scholarship and they're discussing this issue of Markan priority, it's the argument that of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, the same perspective gospels, Mark is the prior or first one. So sometimes this in scholarship gets called the synoptic problem, right? The problem being which was the first gospel. And for most scholars for the last couple hundred years, the answer is Mark. Okay, and we're going to talk for just a moment about a few of the reasons why people think that Mark was first. But I want to stress there's not, this is a somewhat, in 2,000 years, it's only been about the last 250, 300 that people have thought Mark was first. So it could be that that's wrong. And even today, not every single New Testament scholar believes in Markan priority, but the vast majority do. And I think it makes good sense. But your faith is not dependent upon your answer to the synoptic problem, right? So if you want to think Luke came first or Matthew, that's totally fine. But here are some of the reasons why Mark seems to be first. And we're going to discuss that. Then we're going to look at a little comparison of how this whole synoptic thing works. And that'll kind of conclude this video. So one of the things that you notice if you're just even flipping through the Gospels is that Mark is quite a bit shorter than Matthew and Luke, right? So that doesn't prove anything, right? I mean, why would that mean that Mark is first? But it seems a little bit suggestive, right? So if you read Matthew all the way through and then turn to Mark and read it all the way through, one of the things you'll notice is that in terms of action, the events, the things that Jesus does, Matthew and Mark agree very, very closely. And same with Luke. Like if you read all three Gospels together, a lot of the synoptic stuff is the plot line, right? The events happen in the same order in all three Gospels. The healing miracles that Jesus performs are very similar in all three. The supernatural miracles, the feeding of the 5,000 or the calming of Jesus a couple times is in a boat and huge storms come up and he calms nature. Like one time he's walking on water and calms the storm. One time he's asleep in a boat with his friends and he calms the storm. Well, those stories appear almost identically in all three Gospels. So what you notice, though, if you read all three of them together, is while they all have the same action, Mark has almost nothing else beyond that, right? So Mark seems to be a story of Jesus' life that is almost completely based on the things Jesus did. Now, you do have him talking during some of these actions. He'll heal someone and then have a conversation with people about that. But what you don't have very much in Mark is Jesus telling stories, what are called parables. You don't have Jesus sitting and spending the afternoon talking to a huge crowd, which is in Matthew and Luke sometimes called the Sermon on the Mount, which is either a collection of Jesus's teaching or one big chunk of talking that maybe lasted a few hours. Mark doesn't really have any of that. So one of the questions that people have, if Mark was not first, say Mark had access to Matthew or Luke, why would you take a story that had all of this really wonderful stuff that Jesus said, these brilliant stories and spiritually meaningful stories, or this great sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, that has been, one of the highlights of kind of Western literature and spirituality for centuries, and why would you cut that out, right? Like if Mark is not the first one, why would Mark leave out really good material and have only a simple basic gospel that had almost nothing about what Jesus had to say, but just what he did? So that's one of the first clues that leads scholars to think, well, maybe Mark tells kind of this basic story, and then Matthew and Luke are kind of like Mark 2.0, right? Like Mark with the basic plot line, but let's add some of the teaching that Jesus also had. So if there are sometimes this is illustrated by stacking the three gospels side by side. If you just look at them, you'll notice that Mark is a smaller stack, right? It's a much shorter gospel. There's very little. It just doesn't compare at all in terms of length to Matthew and Luke. But almost everything that is in Mark also shows up in Luke, also shows up in Matthew. And obviously pointing to these names backwards on my computer screen is difficult for me. So Matthew and Luke have the same material that Mark has, but they just add stuff on. They add extra material. So that's a clue. Another clue, and this would take a while to really demonstrate, is that Mark is much more simplistic in its writing. This is kind of exaggerating a tiny bit, but it helps illustrate the point. So imagine if you took, like, your parents collected all your assignments from grade school on, and like say in sixth grade you had some essay that you had to write, and you got a good grade on it. You got a 93 or something, but it was written by a sixth grader, and your parents collected it and kept it. And then in college, your senior year in college, you get assigned the exact same topic, and your parents are like, "Oh, remember when you wrote about that in sixth grade? Let's get that out and look at it." Right? You would probably go, "Oh, hey, here's some good work, some things that I liked about, but boy, my writing stunk as a sixth grader. Like I just used the same words over and over again. I didn't have a very complex vocabulary. My writing style, I just used the exact same format for every sentence. I used really way too much. Like this is really important. It's really valuable. It's a really hot day. It was really cold the next day." You have words that just repeat over and over again, and that's not good writing, right? And as you become a better communicator, you get a more complex vocabulary. You develop more elaborate, more expressive ways to make a point. Your writing improves, essentially, right? So if you're assigned that as a junior in college, the same topic, you're probably not going to take your sixth grade paper and just try to turn it in, right? You're going to recognize, oh, this isn't, yes, I can tell that it's me, that some of the same ideas I had then I still have now, but boy, I would like to improve it quite a bit. I'd like to beef up or dress up the writing style. And that seems to be what happens with Matthew and Luke, right? That as you compare where they're similar in some of the very basic frameworks of what Mark is doing. But when they make changes, they either add material altogether that wasn't in either, and we'll talk about that in just a second, or they make small changes that improve Mark, right? Where Mark repeats the same adverbs and adjectives over and over again, Matthew and Luke diversify the language quite a bit. They add more, they flesh stories out a bit. They don't typically add details, although we're going to end by looking at one example where they definitely do. But they just, They just make things better, right? So again, that doesn't prove Mark is first, but the question arises, if you had access to the paper you wrote as a junior, why would you go back and take out all the really excellent writing you've developed over the years and make it sound like a sixth grader? Like, why would you kind of dumb it down? You would go the other direction, right? Like you would improve your writing over time. Like when you do a final draft of a paper in college, you're not trying to make it worse. You're trying to improve it. So Matthew and Mark, from a literary standpoint, from a grammar standpoint, are kind of improved versions of Mark, and so that's kind of a second really huge issue that seems to improve it. There's other things. There's some historical hints as to when, how far after Jesus, particularly in terms of how they relate to this huge event that happens in 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem, that lead people to think maybe Matthew and Luke were written after 70 and Mark may be written before. There's some other things like that, but for our purposes, if you just kind of even had those two basic ideas, that why would you take out teaching material that's really valuable if it's there, and why would you pare the story down to just its bare bones? That seems illogical. But also, why would you take good, rich language, good, rich writing, and make it more juvenile, make it more sounding like a middle school kid or something? And Mark has a much more basic vocabulary, basic literary format than either Matthew or Luke. So, at the end of the day, it doesn't so much matter which comes first, but I do want you to know that this is how scholars have kind of looked at this. And for the last couple hundred years, the vast, vast majority of New Testament scholars have thought Mark was the first gospel. And so I'll ask you to know that on the final exam. You'll need to know what Markan priority means. You'll need to know what synoptic means, what redactor means. Okay, so now I want to introduce one more term, and then we're going to close this video by looking at two stories that sort of show this comparison, both how similar Matthew and Mark are, but also a key difference between them, right? So this term I want you to know is pericope. Okay, so write that down in your notes. Would make a good matching question on the final. A pericope. So a pericope is, in gospel terms, kind of these little small units of writing, right? So within a larger story, say the Gospel of Matthew, you have little bit, so you're familiar with these even if you've never heard this term before, if you've read the Gospels at all. So you're reading along, and probably how pericope are noted in most English-speaking Bibles is you'll have a little heading. I'm going to show you in mine, right? So if you're looking at this Bible, you'll see Mary visits Elizabeth, the birth of John the Baptist, John the Baptist's birth foretold. Those are pericope, right? So a pericope is a short story completely contained within itself, embedded in a larger story, right? So when you read Jesus feeds 5,000, it's usually like a 2 or 3 paragraph little story, but if you cut it in half, it wouldn't make any sense. Like if you just cut halfway through the feeding of the 5,000 and moved one half here and the other half in a different direction, it would be nonsensical. But you could take the whole, this story, one day Jesus feeds 5,000 people. If you took that story out, you could move it around, right? So the pericope themselves are they're self-contained. They're Jesus teaches about the Sabbath. Jesus feeds 5,000. Jesus walks on water. Jesus goes to Jerusalem. So they're usually like these little set pieces, scenes in a play, for example. If you stop the scene right in the middle, everything's confusing. But sometimes you could take a scene and move it to a different part of the story. So one of the things gospel writers do is they move stories around sometimes, or they add a little pericope in. So we're going to see an example here to close of exactly these things happening. So this is going to kind of play it out. So I've included on the Foxtail site a document called Gospel Comparison. So if you'll open that up and look at this as we're talking about it, you can see both how similar Matthew and Mark are, but also how they sometimes vary from one another. So looking at this, it's looking at two stories. The first from Mark 9, and the second, that's actually not correct. Let me get from Mark 6, and then the second from Matthew 12. So if you look at both of these stories side by side, you'll see in this piece we're looking at, the first piece is Jesus talks about a prophet without honor in Mark. Then you go to Matthew. Jesus also talks about a prophet without honor in Matthew. So far, very similar. Then Jesus moves to a new story. He sends out the 12. So like back and forth, we're looking at the same document. Like things seem very, very similar as we're going. And this is Matthew 13 and 14. John the Baptist is beheaded in Mark. John the Baptist is beheaded in Matthew. John feeds the 5,000 in Mark. He feeds the 5,000 in Matthew. So far you see the synoptic principle kind of playing itself out, right? And now we're going to get to the story we're going to focus on here for a few minutes. So I'm going to bounce back and forth, but you'll kind of see how similar they are. This is also in the document. So in Mark, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. Matthew, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. So a tiny change, but they seem to be telling the same story. This comes right after the beheading of John. This comes right after the feeding of the 5,000. And in both stories, the disciples get in a boat and cross the lake. Jesus stays by himself. After leaving them, Jesus went up on a mountainside to pray in Mark. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray in Matthew. Same thing. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land. He saw his disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against him. That's Mark. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So you see some of these small changes, right? Buffeted. That's a word that's added other than just the wind was against them. The wind is buffeting them, right? So Matthew has elaborated just a tiny bit. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake, and they thought he was a ghost, Mark says. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them on the lake, walking on the lake. Went out to them walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. They cried out. That's Matthew. Mark. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Matthew. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." And then if you look at the document, there's a huge gap in Mark, because Mark goes silent, while Matthew says, "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, crying out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And then Matthew says, when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Mark says, then he climbed into the boat with them and the wind died down. Right? So do you see how, like, they're telling the exact same story about Jesus walking on water. They even end the story the same. Jesus climbs in the boat and the wind stops. But Matthew adds an entirely different little pericope, a little story about Peter also getting out of the boat. Peter also walking on water. Right? If Mark was not the first gospel, why would he read that story about Matthew and then leave it out? Like, that seems like a fascinating story. How often in human history have people gotten out of boats and walked on water? And here in Matthew, Peter does that. Peter, one of Jesus' closest followers, not for very long, but for a few minutes, walks on water with Jesus. That's pretty amazing, right? But Mark doesn't tell us anything about that. But as soon as Matthew is telling us that story, his story goes right back to looking like Mark's. They climb in the boat, the wind dies down. Okay, so far what we've seen, I think, is both the similarities. Matthew and Mark are clearly talking about the same event. All the things that preceded it are the same, and the description of everything right up until Peter walks on the water is the same. They're in a boat, they're scared, it's a windy, stormy night, they see Jesus walking on the water, they think he's a ghost. He climbs in the boat and the storm calms down. That's all shared. The one thing that's added, the new material, the new pericope, is this little walking on water piece, right? So you see both the similarities, but also Matthew changing or improving the story in some ways. Okay, so we just want to end with one odd little bit also, okay? And that's how the two stories wrap things up. And so this is kind of, they're less telling the story at this point and more interpreting it for us. Okay, so here's how Mark ends. Jesus climbs in the boat, the wind calms down, and then it says they were completely amazed by this, for they did not understand, they being Jesus' friends, his disciples that are in the boat. They are amazed because they did not understand about the loaves, and that's referring to the feeding of the 5,000. Their hearts were hardened. So Jesus gets in the boat, and Mark and his friends are freaked out by it, and they don't understand what happened because they have hard hearts. Like the last time we really talked about in this course, somebody with a hard heart, it was Pharaoh in Egypt, right? That's not a very good phrase for Jesus' followers. They have hard hearts. They don't understand who he is. How does Matthew in the story? So when they climbed in the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped Jesus, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Right? Matthew doesn't have anything about the hard hearts. He doesn't have anything about them not understanding. In Matthew, the guys in the boat worship Jesus. They totally understand who he is, and they're deeply moved by it. Right? So that leaves us with a couple questions. Is one of these two wrong? Is one telling the truth and the other is lying? What I would tend to suggest is there's 12 folks in the boat, right? At least 12. My guess is probably some of them were confused and didn't understand, had hard hearts, as it were. And some of them were deeply moved and worshiped Jesus, saying, "You are the Son of God." Right? Like in my mind, I think the most likely reality is that both of those things happen, that Mark is half right and Matthew's half right. But what is interesting to me, and this is kind of the question I want to leave you with for this video, is why, if that's the case, why don't they tell us that, right? Why does Mark only highlight the ones who don't understand, who have hard hearts, whereas Matthew only highlights those who have soft hearts, who see this event and worship Jesus? And one of the things I'm going to suggest and we're going to look at, in Mark, this is kind of a theme. Right, one of the tropes or literary devices that Mark is going to use is that Jesus' followers often are kind of idiots. Right, they're going to see all kinds of stuff, all kinds of amazing things that Jesus does, and over again in Mark, they're going to be confused by it or not understand it. Whereas in Matthew, Jesus' followers much more often like, "Oh, I totally get it." Right? One of the editorial devices, the literary devices that Mark seems to use is, hey, whatever you do, don't be like the disciples, because they were fools. They did not understand who Jesus was. They did not understand what Jesus was doing. Whereas Matthew, one of his literary devices is, hey, follow the example of the disciples. If you want to be a follower of Jesus, be like them, because when Jesus did things, they totally got it, and they followed Jesus in the right way, in the way that you should model yourself after. Right? So they're telling the same story, but they're also interpreting it. Right? So in addition to like making editorial choices, they're also kind of interpreting events as they happen. Right? So just one last thought on that is like how often, you have a conversation with a family member or a conversation with a friend, and one of you thinks it was a good, normal conversation, and one of you gets offended by it. Like your feelings get hurt, you get upset, like, I can't believe they were so rude. And then you talk later on and like, man, I've been pissed off at you all day. What? And the other person's like, gosh, I had no idea that's what you thought happened. I wasn't angry at all. I just was in a hurry. That's why I kind of blew you off, right? You both experienced the same event, but you interpreted it differently. And one of the things that seems to be going on in the four Gospels is sometimes they will talk about the exact same event, but apply slightly different interpretations to what went on, how people responded, or what the significance of that event was. So one of the things we're trying to pay attention to as we go along in these stories is, why are they making those choices? Like, why are they interpreting the story this way or that? How are they similar to each other, but also how are they different? All right, so that is our first video about the Gospels. We'll be probably making a couple more here in the next couple days, and that'll get us to spring break, and then we'll evaluate after spring break what's going on with the virus and whether or not we're back on campus. Have a good day.